Yes.
Thank you. Professor Steer, I just have a handful of questions from core participants. Now, the answer to my first question may well be self-evident from your earlier evidence, but I've been asked to ask you about it. Has there ever been a justification for giving every woman a unit of blood following childbirth, no matter the clinical indications?
No.
You gave evidence, I should have said at the beginning, these questions are scattered through all of your evidence so that there is less of a link between them. You gave evidence that in recent years, because of prion disease, women were informed that all we can say is best efforts have been taken to make sure the blood's safe. Why did prion disease trigger that additional caveat?
I think because there was such widespread publicity about it at the time, mad cow disease, and you couldn't, anyone who'd given, well, it was even in the American media, and people were not allowed to give blood in America if they'd been living in the UK and so on. I just think it was the publicity.
You reflected on your own understanding of hepatitis arising from the sad death of your colleague.
Yes.
More generally, was it common for obs and gynae clinicians to be aware of the risks of transmitting hepatitis through a blood transfusion during the 1970s and 1980s?
I think it was particularly in the urban areas where there were concentrations of immigrants from Southeast Asia in particular, because of the relatively high incidence. I suspect that perhaps in more rural areas where it was mainly people of local origin, where it wasn't an issue, knowledge might have been less less good. But I think for most people in the big cities, the issue of hepatitis B was quite widely appreciated.
And in terms of what women were told, what advice was given to them, the inquiry's heard and knows that hepatitis C was identified in 1989, but screening generally didn't commence till 1991. In those circumstances where an infectious agent had been identified, but screening of the blood hadn't yet been introduced, what advice was given in that period about the risks of transmission of a virus through a blood transfusion?
I don't think it specifically addressed that issue that I can remember.
In circumstances where a woman was to have a non-emergency caesarean section, what information was given to women about the risks of a blood transfusion should it be required?
What we would usually have said is that for a straightforward elective caesarean section, the likelihood of needing a blood transfusion was very low. If the woman then said, but supposing it was necessary, then you would go into more detail about it. But I don't recollect giving women any detailed information about blood transfusion for a straightforward elective caesarean section, as I said, because it was so rarely needed.
So it would depend on the woman asking for that information?
By and large, that's my recollection, yes.
And finally, you spoke about the difficulties for doctors to know about guidelines and have access to those guidelines. In that context, do doctors have a continuing professional development obligation to keep updated?
Absolutely. There is a requirement for CPD in order to be reaccredited. But that can be acquired in lots of different ways, and there's no sort of set, as far as I'm aware, at the point of when I retired from clinical practice, there was no set requirement that you had to read or be knowledgeable about X, Y, and Z. You could acquire credits towards your revalidation from a whole variety of sources. So it was a sort of pick and mix, really. And that's where I think it would have been helpful if we'd introduced a more systematic curriculum for training and indeed for revalidation. If people have been given more guidance about what specifically they should update themselves about, I think that would have been helpful. That may well happen, I suspect, in the future.
So they're the questions I've been asked to ask. I'm just going to look behind me to check there's nothing else. So they're all the questions from behind me.
Yes, well, I just have one question, really. It's a request, really, for your views. And it arises in this way out of your evidence. I was reflecting, after you said it, on what you'd said this morning about your attempts to introduce training with your 90 sessions, and you began very successfully in the first year and it tailed off after 3. And that, I think, was because of the severe demands of time and pressures on the NHS and doctors. And in your witness statement, you say that there was a major change that you noticed after Calmanisation in the implementation of the European Working Time Directive, which meant that junior doctors could no longer be required to work more than 48 hours per week, and that meant that many more would work part-time, and there were many more people working. And then you went on to say that one of the effects was that if you asked anyone who was treating them, they would no longer say, I'm being treated by X, I'm being treated by the hospital. So the hospital has taken over, as you see it, from the individual. One of the consequences that you identify of the change in doctors was that patients now get much more information given to them because it's not just a question of trust. It made me reflect on the whole basis for clinical freedom, about which we've heard quite a bit in this inquiry. And if clinical freedom means the right of one doctor to make his best judgment as to what would suit his particular patient and then go ahead, that, I take it, is much less apparent these days than it once was, is it?
Yeah, I think there's a greater awareness of the need for standards, and that, well, when I'm teaching on courses and so on, I do emphasize to people that when they make clinical judgments, they should expect that at some point they may be asked to justify why they've made that particular judgment. And they can't just say, because I thought that was the right thing to do. They will be expected to give some sort of evidential basis for why they chose to do X rather than Y.
And it would follow that if indeed care is more and more being delivered by teams rather than by individuals, that there is within the fact of the team a greater likelihood that the members of the team will have read the guidelines between them, even if, as you pointed out, there may be rather too much for one person to take in whilst doing everything else as well. Am I right about that?
It's certainly an important benefit of teamwork that if you've got half a dozen people working together, one of them is likely to say, you know, I read this and we should be doing that, and pass that information around, and people saying, oh, I didn't know that, just like my colleague introduced me to the idea of doing pertussis vaccination during pregnancy. The bigger the team, that's more likely to happen, provided the team is working well as a team. And that's the critical element. I've always been in favour of teamwork, and recently, for example, wrote a leading article in a major journal on multidisciplinary care. And in a sense, I've always been in favour of that. My father, for 25 years, taught pilots for British Airways. And they moved from when people came out of the forces, they just flew aeroplanes by the seat of their pants, to more and more having guidelines and checklists and teamwork and what they call flat hierarchies. And things like situational awareness came in, and crew psychology, and all of these are gradually being introduced into aspects of medical care as well, to look at the way teams operate. And I think personally that's the way forward, that we should have teams working together who have a common ethos, who work together to look at the guidelines and advise one another and cross-check one another's abilities. So, for example, a major research project I'm involved in at the moment, being coordinated by the THIS Institute in Cambridge, recently been funded £2 million by the Department of Health and Social Care to look at care during labour. And in particular, we're looking at introducing a new approach which systematises the use of teams so that decisions will always be made in the context of teams, not just by an individual junior doctor or an individual junior or an individual midwife. And that team should also include the mother and any family members that she wishes to involve. This is a formal initiative which I'm delighted that I've been able to help to push forward and promote. And I think personally that's the way to go. The recent Shrewsbury inquiry has come up with similar comments, and the parliamentary inquiry that was published last summer also made similar points, that people practicing in isolation are always at risk of not knowing what the latest guideline says they should be doing, and that teamwork, which involves regular appraisals and updates, is definitely the way to go. And because medicine has become much more powerful, it's also become much more complicated. And the idea that one person could encapsulate all that knowledge and wisdom might have been viable in the 50s, or possibly even in the 60s, but today it's not. And as an individual, one has to be aware of the fact that there are always gaps in one's knowledge, and that working with other people and cross-checking your decisions with them and saying, you're happy with this, if I miss something, is always going to be an important safeguard. And I think that's the way for the future medical practice.
So the advantages of team working are the greater transfer of information, the greater likelihood of transfer of information, something which you have stressed throughout your evidence. The debate and discussion, which there should be within a well-organised team, and the fact you can't sensibly, in any team involving medical care of a person, leave the patient out of it.
Absolutely. And it's protective of the patient. It's also actually protective of the individual medical and midwifery staff, because they're not shouldering the entire responsibility for what may be life-changing decisions, life-saving decisions. For the last sort of 10 years of my career, I was mainly looking after women who had important heart disease in pregnancy, and sometimes that can be fatal. So these were in very challenging cases and very difficult decisions. And I would always work with an anaesthetist, with a cardiologist. We pioneered the concept of having clinics with all these people seeing that patient together as a group. And you can do the same sort of thing on the labour ward with midwives, junior doctors in training, senior doctors, taking a much more collaborative approach to major decision making. And I personally think it's safer. And personally, I always slept sounder at night knowing that when we'd made a major decision, which could be vital for that patient, it wasn't just me, it was the team that we agreed that it was the best way forward. So it was more likely to be, in my view, to be correct, and also less likely to be a responsibility just for one individual.
When this was raised, again in the context of critical freedom, earlier on in the inquiry, a couple of points were made the other way, and I'd be interested to know what you would think about might be the answers to them. They were that if there is safety in a team, as you've described, it can also mean that nobody actually takes the interest and responsibility in making the actual decision, because they don't need to, because it's shared, because it's not their responsibility. So it's a question of accountability, and the idea of having one person who is, as it were, orchestrating the team. It may go back to the question of how you manage the team you've been describing, or how it's run. But what's your answer to those
Absolutely. There always has to be, and in fact, in crew resource management, and I've been involved at the Chelsea and Westminster in simulation exercises, where you get people together to show them the benefit of defining roles, and somebody has to take the lead role. So what you do is you get half a dozen people, and then you present them with an acute scenario. So it might be commonly is a major hemorrhage. And then you look to see, and we video what the reaction of that team is. And very often it's a bit chaotic. And when we then get people back for debriefing, we point out, now the first thing you have to decide to do is roles. Who's going to do what? Who's going to take the lead? Who's going to be the scribe? Who's going to go and do the blood tests, etc. And if you start with that, you then end up resolving that problem, because the lead person is the one that takes the final decision, but with the input of the rest of the team. Now, that does require a flat hierarchy. This comes into crew resource management. In other words, any member of the team can challenge a comment or a decision made by someone else. There is a process called calling a hug, which is a technical term which is actually on the NHS website, calling a huddle, sorry, not a hug, a huddle. And that is in a way of getting a team together. You can't have a team looking after one individual all the time. What happens is if something goes wrong, they then know who they call, they get that team together, they have a huddle, and this is the technical term, and then the lead person makes the decision. This decision includes the woman and her family, and that's very important because it deals with the issue of consent and information. So, for example, in my cardiac clinic with the cardiologist and the anaesthetist, and we'd have a midwife and usually trainees and so on as well, we would actually come to a joint decision about the best way forward for that woman's care, which included the woman herself. So she knew why we'd come to that decision, what the pros and cons were, and as a result, she was much more likely to be compliant with the care that we recommended because she understood what it was for, rather than us telling her, do this.
Or she might be able to suggest what might suit her better.
Absolutely. And for the last 10 years of my practice, I always worked in a room which had access to the internet, because in the field I was working, complex heart disease, it was not that rare for women to turn up with a condition that I wasn't familiar with. And so what we would then do is sit down and look it up on the computer and work out the best plan of management together. And then we might find someone, an expert that we could consult later and so on. But this is a way of explaining to people the basis on which you're making your medical recommendations. So they don't have to say, why did you make that decision? Because they know why you made it, because they were part of it. To me, that just makes absolute common sense. And I just found it a really rewarding way to go forward, and it creates a really good relationship with the patient when you do it this way.
So that replaces what you spoke about in your witness statement as being the relationship of intimate trust between two individuals.
Yes.
You now have the consent, informed consent by those who are members of the huddle in that particular woman's case.
Exactly.
Yes, I see. And I suppose it also has the benefit, does it, that when it comes to entering up records, there is the ability, at least, to have a cross-check that things have been done.
Yep.
And I gather in the airline industry, the idea of there being a check, so that two different people check that something has been done, is an integral part of ensuring that airlines don't fall out of the sky.
Well, again, because of my background and having been with my father when he was doing training sessions, which I always found very fascinating, was one of the reasons I always insisted that if I was giving an injection or putting up blood, I insisted that someone else came and cross-checked what I was doing, even though it wasn't commonly expected because I was a doctor. Sometimes people thought I was being a bit fussy, but I stuck to my guns because I thought it was the safe way to proceed.
Well, if you're being fussy, it sounds like being the right thing to be.
Well, that's what I thought too, but...
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I don't know if there are any questions which might arise out of that discussion, because it's gone beyond, I think, what you might have anticipated from the witness statement, although it's founded in it.
No, sir, there's nothing that's being flagged from behind me.
Thank you.
Professor Steer, is there anything else you would like to add?
Okay. Said enough, thank you.
Well, it's been a delight listening to you. You may have wondered when you were asked to come, why does the infected blood inquiry want to hear from you? What have you got to say? But let me tell you that what we've heard a lot of in the course of this inquiry is the experiences of people who've had transfusions. If I say a single transfusion, what I mean is on one or more single occasions, as opposed to people who require transfusions for the treatment of haemophilia. But, quite a large number of those, judging by the witness statements which I've read, occurred in the, around the time of childbirth. And so that's why we wanted to know really what the practice was from someone who had a position and could tell us. And you've done just that, and I really want to thank you very much for that and for your thoughts at the end.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, shall we take a break
Yes.
for 5 minutes until we're... All right, you can do as you wish, but until we're ready to begin with our next witness.
Thank you, sir. If we could just have 5 minutes.
Yes, so let's say 10 past, shall we? 10 past 2.
Thank you, sir.